Thank you so much for having me. It's amazing to be here. I wish I could spend the whole day and learn from you guys about what you do here, because it seems like this is something quite special that you have here and something I haven't really seen in Sydney. I don't know, is there a, no, it's pretty, well, yeah. Everything good happens in Victoria. Yeah, it's you know, literally every time I'm invited down, invited to speak, almost every time it's in Victoria, because there's just so much going on here. My husband's just like, can't they organise something in Sydney? Damn. Anyway, so I wanted to talk to you today about several things. I want to talk to you about coercive control, because I mean, a lot of you will understand that pretty intimately, but it's not really a conversation we've had in Australia to the same extent that it's been, say, in the UK, where in England and now Scotland and Ireland, it's now a criminal offence, and in England has been since 2015. And so I want to sort of anatomise that for you. Can I just see, before I do, and this is not like a test, but who's read the book? Okay, sorry if I repeat things that you've already read and you're like, yeah, go. But I think it's important to sort of like to run through this. So I want to start by telling you a story about Sarah, which some of you may remember that name from the book. And in a lot of ways, it's a pretty familiar story, because when she started out with her partner Carl, he was a charming, vivacious, funny, self-effacing man, until the day that she fell pregnant. And in the space of a day, he changed from someone who could make fun of himself, was charismatic, to someone who was filled with anger, entitlement and vitriol. And you know, we talk a lot about red flags, like here's, you know, love bombing, you know, possessiveness, obsessiveness. None of those signs were present in Carl. He was also a fierce advocate for gender equality, loved his partner's independence. You know, there was no warning for Sarah that anything was potentially wrong in their relationship. So suddenly, literally within a day, he was expecting Sarah to focus entirely on him, and his behaviour suddenly ticked all the boxes for coercive control. As she told me, he tried to control what I wore, what I did, where I went, how tidy the house was, and when I saw family and friends. He became obsessed with the minutiae, from what I ate to what time the blinds were drawn. Now, Sarah, she was a trauma doctor in a hospital, and she knew exactly what abuse looked like. She treated it every day. And so she told everyone. She told her friends and family, she told his friends and family, she told her GP, she told her obstetrician, she told them that he had assaulted her during pregnancy. I mean, like, she was so open about it, which makes her case, you know, reasonably unusual. She also got him in to see the leading psychologist for domestic abuse in Melbourne, who will remain unnamed, but maybe some of you have some ideas who that might be. She says she worked her partner Carl like a psych patient, making sure he got exercise, that he wasn't exposed to stress, that everything was taken care of so he could focus on his internal process and so he wouldn't be provoked. And she was just entirely fixated on returning him to the man that he was before she fell pregnant. Then when she gave birth to her daughter Alice, things got worse. So Alice was born with breathing problems. She was in and out of intensive care. But Carl refused to believe that she had medical problems, as I'm sure some of you have seen is common with many perpetrators. He stopped Sarah calling an ambulance for Alice. He cut off her private health insurance. He'd even turn off the breathing monitor. He'd tip express breast milk down the drain to control how much Alice was allowed to have. And meanwhile, he was taking photographs of Sarah when he thought she wasn't holding Alice's head properly to get proof of her inadequate parenting. When I asked Sarah if there'd been any physical assaults, she talked about them like they were an afterthought. And it was as if they just weren't important to her. And they were like really serious. He raped her twice while she was in labour. He ejaculated on her face while she was asleep. Like, these weren't minor assaults, they were serious, and they were just the ones that came to mind for her immediately. Everything basically escalated the week that Q&A ran its special program on domestic abuse. When Sarah was watching it, and again, probably an unusual thing for a victim to actually watch that with her partner at home, Carl just started ranting, raving, swearing that all of these women deserved to die and it was their partners who were the real victims. And Sarah was like, this is really alarming. She reported it to police, and she also called the psychologist. And the psychologist told her, oh, look, I think that a lot of men would have been disturbed by that episode, and that Carl's behaviour is not that abnormal. she thought it was really abnormal and she was really alarmed. So one night, a few days later, their baby daughter Alice just wouldn't settle. She was just crying, and suddenly Carl rushed into the bedroom, picked her up out of her cot and shook her violently, shaking her up above and down his head, yelling, "Shut up, shut up." And Sarah saw this on the baby monitor. She ran into Alice's room, grabbed her out of his arms, and he mumbled something about making a mistake and just went back to bed. But Sarah, as a doctor, knew that Alice's life was in immediate danger. So in secret, she called 000. Now she had to do that in secret because she knew that if he heard her calling 000, that he may come in and either harm or kill them both. The minutes she waited for the ambulance to arrive were, in her words, long, arduous and terrifyingly slow. One of my greatest fears, she said, was that these would be the last moments I would spend with Alice before she succumbed to potentially fatal intracranial bleeds. I said a private goodbye to my baby, telling her that everything would be okay. This story always gets me. And that whatever happened, I loved her with all my heart. All the while, Sarah was trying to keep Alice as quiet as possible so that Carl wouldn't discover she'd called the ambulance. So for his assault on Alice, for which she recovered fully and has no permanent damage, Carl was charged with several offences, including conduct endangering life, serious injury and unlawful assault. He was offered a diversion program, good behaviour for 9 months and a men's behaviour change program. He broke the good behaviour part, was expelled from the first program. He even pled guilty to breaking these conditions and was found guilty without conviction and received a $350 fine. Sarah, on the other hand, now devotes her entire life to keeping Alice safe. She continued to receive threats from Carl so serious, she and Alice were moved into crisis accommodation 5 times in 1 year. The most terrifying thing for her now is that, unlike when she was still in the relationship, she can no longer keep tabs on him. She doesn't know how big a risk he is from day to day. And I'm sure a lot of you have worked with women who feel like they have like an almost psychic connection with their partner, or, you know, or men who are in same-sex relationships, that they feel like it's like an umbilical feeling. They can feel when something's turning, and when the perpetrator's out of sight, it's very difficult to know just how great that risk is. So in the months after she left, she was running 5 concurrent court cases. It consumed an enormous amount of her time. She had to have a safety plan in place at Alice's daycare with police, and she was terrified of taking her to shopping centres because if Carl turned up and took her, Sarah would be powerless to stop him because there was no family law order in place and he was her father. Now, she was terrified that he would take her to family court. So even with this enormous threat present, she actually facilitated weekly visits that were supervised by her parents. She would sit outside and monitor the exit. He would take photos and share them, showing what a perfect parent he was. He actually, on Alice's birthday, brought cake, ate a bit himself, she had a little bit. He then took the cake home. He dressed Alice several times in different clothes and took photos of her to look like he'd visited her more than once. And this is the sort of image management that you see quite a lot, like surprisingly often, where perpetrator fathers are posting stuff on Facebook to show how involved they are with their children. So afraid was Sarah that the family law system would end up ordering Alice to spend unsupervised time with Carl, she even considered going back to him so that she could reliably protect her. As she told me, he would need to get through me to get to her. About 3 years after I first interviewed her, Sarah told me that Carl had just applied to the family court for full custody. To defend that case, Sarah had to work insane hours, so she was now working back in the medical field. She was earning okay money, but all of that was going to legal fees. She had to come up with $130,000 to pay her barrister because she knew from the advice that she got that basically her ability to protect her daughter could be contingent on the quality of the lawyer that she had to represent her. She is utterly terrified that if Alice is ordered into unsupervised care, Carl will end up killing her. As she told me, I've seen and felt his impulsive aggression firsthand. It may not happen the first time, but there would be a trigger. She'd cry, she'd impose her will against his, something would happen and he'd lose it. My fear is that she could be thrown off the Westgate Bridge like Darcy Freeman. No parent should be asked to hand their child over to someone who almost killed them. But as we know, too often in the family law system, they are, and not just handed over for unsupervised visits, but even full-time care. So I tell you this story to show that even when a woman does everything right, it's not her choice as to whether the violence and the control stops. I mean, all of us get frustrated to a certain extent, even with our best understandings of this subject, when you've got to a certain point with a victim and you feel like they're ready to leave, or they're ready to make a move towards ending, attempting to end the violence, I should say, or get out of that situation, especially where there are children involved, and then they go back, and it feels like it's this snakes and ladder game, right? But I guess that every time I'm frustrated by that, I think about what may be waiting for her on the other side of leaving. And the fact that she actually may feel safer in the relationship where she can keep her eye on him than outside of it. That she may be terrified of him getting unsupervised access to her kids. The fact that she may be forced to live on food vouchers because she doesn't have enough money to pay legal bills and food. And the fact that even in cases with no complications, it costs on average $18,000 to leave. So her case was textbook coercive control. And, we talk about coercive control being like a course of conduct, ongoing set of behaviours, very insidious. It's very difficult to identify. But there are discrete behaviours inside that you can identify, like isolating from friends and family, micromanaging her life. He set petty, arbitrary rules, like what time the shades were to be drawn. He interfered with their daughter's access to medical care. He made direct and indirect threats. And I think that's, for us, it's very difficult for women who have never been threatened directly, but the atmosphere of threat is created. So when Carla's raving around the house saying all these women deserve to die, in the full knowledge that both of them have that they are in a domestic violence situation themselves, that's a threat. Right? But how do you represent that in court? How do you tell that to a judge that I was threatened? Well, it's not a direct threat. He sexually assaulted her, and he did so in ways that were intended to humiliate and degrade her, like ejaculating on her face in her sleep. He threatened to report her as an unsafe parent. He deprived their daughter of basic needs by tipping express breast milk down the drain. These are all discrete, identifiable behaviours in a system that is otherwise hard to detect. So what we understand about coercive control, this is a term that was popularised by the American forensic social worker Evan Stark, is that the controlling behaviours that are comprised in coercive control are one of the most telltale predictors of future homicide. I think the legal system especially needs to understand and be able to distinguish coercive controllers as best as one can, because there's grey area. Because they need to know why it is that so many women seem unable to leave. That it's not because they have a victim complex, or because they secretly like the drama, or because they have learned helplessness, that debunked theory that suggests women are so helpless they don't know how to leave, or Stockholm syndrome, which is one of my pet hates. We can tell the story of Stockholm syndrome later for those who don't know it. It's amazing and goes back to how so many of these victim blaming tropes are just rooted in misogyny. They need to understand this so that they can do everything in their power to protect the women and children who are trapped in it. So today I want to take you behind the scenes of coercive control, to strip the course of conduct back to its essential elements and show you how it affects women and critically how it affects children. But before we do, I want to touch briefly on the subject of love. We don't talk much about love when we speak about domestic abuse, but aside from fear, love and loyalty is often central to the system of coercive control. Unless a marriage or partnership is arranged or forced, it's often love that first binds a victim to her abuser, and love that makes her forgive him when he says he won't abuse her again. And I must say, just to people in the room who deal with LGBTQI clients, apologies for the heteronormative language in here. It's the binary system here does not have to apply. Coercive control applies in same-sex relationships as well. So please excuse me for using he and she's. It is love that keeps her hope alive long after that hope should have been vanquished. It is love that makes her conceive of the abuse as some kind of aberration, a flaw to be fixed in an otherwise good person, a person they want to stay with. How many women and men have said to you that they don't want to leave, they just want the abuse to stop? And how long has it taken the sector maybe to come around to that way of thinking, that actually just pressuring a woman to leave and making it a simple binary, you either stay or leave, doesn't actually fit the lived experience that families have. It's also obviously the victim's love that is used and taken advantage of. It's the intimate details she reveals, her deepest desires, shames, fears and secrets that the perpetrator uses to create a blueprint for their abuse. The overall system of coercive control may be repeated from one relationship to the next, but the particular tactics or techniques are kaleidoscopic in their variety because each are tailored particularly to the victim. So in same-sex relationships, for example, a perpetrator may threaten to out their partner if their status is still reasonably a secret in public, or to disclose their HIV status, or they may just pressure them not to disclose because it will bring shame on their community. There's something different in every relationship, but each technique tends to fit into the same basic architecture, as we'll see. It may seem totally counterintuitive, but I'm sure, as you hear from a lot of the people you work with, physical violence is not the worst part, and yet we still have physical violence as the pointy end in terms of the way our justice system responds to domestic abuse. As Evan Stark points out, our incident-based approach to domestic violence, in which physical violence is the pointiest end, actually trivialises the victim's experience. It's the mental dislocation, especially of coercive control, which is literally used in other contexts like prisoner of war camps and political prisons as a form of torture, is the hardest thing to recover from. It can also be incredibly hard for the victim to detect because it happens slowly, bit by bit. One of the most common refrains from victims of coercive control is, "I wish he'd just hit me." And I think that there's nowhere near enough understanding that not only that domestic abuse can be not just physical or sexual, that it can be psychological, emotional and financial, but that it need not be physical or sexual at all. That it may only be psychological or financial. That's certainly a hurdle that I don't think we've crossed with the public or with the judicial system. So the dozens of women that I've spoken to want the system to understand just how trapped they are in these relationships and how they don't always act the way the system thinks they should. How they feel like they were living in a kind of fog in which it was impossible to see anything clearly. They want the system to understand that they have acted in line with a logic that may be difficult to identify unless you know the right questions to ask. So we'll consider what questions you could ask that might expose the coercive control she and her children, if she has any, are being subjected to later. So what is coercive control? It's a very particular kind of abuse. How many of you are aware of coercive control as a term and understand it pretty intimately? All down the front, except for a few guys up the back. Okay, so for those of you who aren't so aware of this term, let me just sort of spell it out. It's a very particular kind of abuse because coercive controllers seek to dominate their victims by isolating them, micromanaging their behaviour, humiliating and degrading them, monitoring their movements, gaslighting them, and especially creating an environment of confusion, contradiction, and extreme threat. Now, in heterosexual relationships, it's almost exclusively perpetrated by men, not always, but mostly. But obviously in same-sex relationships, it's perpetrated by either sex because what it's contingent on is one person being able to claim power and dominance over the other. Now, I know obviously coercive control is not a criminal offence in Australia, and I think people have very divided ideas on whether it should be, but I thought it might be helpful to hear how other countries are prosecuting coercive control because a lot of people seem to think it would be virtually impossible to prosecute, but also in our context, it helps us maybe understand how we can better identify coercive control because it contextualises how we respond to that victim, right? So in Scotland, coercive control was criminalised in April, and in 7 months there have been almost 1,000 charges, the vast majority of which are being prosecuted. About 95 to 97% are male perpetrators. So there were concerns, obviously, when it was first introduced across the UK, that we'd see the same kind of thing happen as what happened when domestic violence was first, mandatory arrests were introduced or encouraged, and with women getting arrested or the victim getting arrested. That hasn't really been the case in Scotland, and the reason why is because there is a training, not just a training program for police, but they actually have what they call domestic abuse champions inside every station, about 750 of them. So I think it's almost every station, and their job there is to change the culture, not punitively, but to basically be eyes on what's happening, be able to encourage officers to investigate more fully the arc of the relationship, basically just to be someone that officers can come to and ask questions. So those domestic abuse champions go through really detailed training. It's like 3 days of training, whereas police officers will go through 1 full day and an e-training module, which has been incredibly effective in terms of the feedback. A lot of police officers had, when they first started these courses, and when they were given basically an hour at the beginning of the day to vent their frustrations, that they basically think that victims are nuisances, like there's a lot of unfortunate feelings that police have towards victims because they don't fit inside their system. They don't obey what they need them to do. And it was interesting, I spoke to the domestic abuse lead, Gordon McCready, the other night, particularly so I could relay to you guys what they're doing. And he was saying that, by the end of the day, a lot of those police officers had totally changed their perception of what domestic abuse was. They basically said, no one's ever explained this to us. No one's ever told us why she behaves the way she does or why she makes certain choices. And their empathy was through the roof suddenly, after really being a kind of crime that they were reluctant to attend, or they thought was quite feminized. The junior officer should deal with that. Now when they get there, and what's amazing and innovative about this system is that they not only train the police, they also trained the call-out operators. So in the past, when police would be called out to a domestic violence incident, the call-out operators are pressuring them to get on with it and get on to the next call-out. Now they've been trained not to put pressure on police so that police can conduct the investigation that they need to. So everybody's on board, and it means that the whole system that would make it difficult for police to do their jobs properly, all of that system is now working coherently rather than sort of at cross purposes. So the law in Scotland has to demonstrate that there was a pattern of abusive behaviours, which means 2 or more incidents of abuse that a reasonable person would think would have caused the victim or survivor to suffer physical or psychological harm, including fear, alarm and distress. So these include things like what I was talking about before, isolating a person from friends and family, and they get proof of that by interviewing the family and interviewing the friends, depriving them of basic needs, monitoring them through online communication tools or spyware, taking wages and benefits, threats to reveal or publish personal information, threats to harm a child, threats to hurt or kill, criminal damage like destruction of property, and other complex issues that are really important and difficult for all of us to grapple with, but especially the courts, forcing or coercing the victim to take part in criminal activity like shoplifting or abuse or neglect of the children in order to encourage that victim's self-blame and prevent them from disclosing to authorities. So the list of behaviours that they have are really detailed, and it shows that where they're coming from is with a deep understanding of what coercive control does and what coercion can do to a victim. And the list is not prescriptive because authorities are aware that coercive controllers cater their abuse particularly to their victims. So the distinct behaviours may be quite different, even if the overarching architecture of coercive control is repeated time and again. So when I was talking to Detective Superintendent McCready, who sounds uncannily like Jimmy Barnes, he told me that the genius of their legislation is that all the harms are included under one charge. So physical, sexual, psychological, control, threats, surveillance, they're all considered equal. Now, whether the courts may give a longer sentence for someone who's, doled out really serious physical abuse, we're not sure because we haven't actually seen it go through the courts to that extent. It's only been around for 6 or 7 months. But certainly from the police's perspective, all of these harms are equal to each other. They're all part of the same system of degradation and shame and humiliation and shame, essentially. And there needn't be any physical or sexual violence present for a charge to be laid. Also, critically, the law does not make a distinction between those who intended to cause physical or psychological harm and those who are reckless as to whether that behaviour would cause harm. And that speaks to what we know about perpetrators, that some use coercive control instrumentally as a modus operandi in all of their relationships and can tell you what they do. You know, they can tell you like it's a strategy, right? While others just recreate the same techniques spontaneously, almost unconsciously. They do it, they think, in response to what the victim is doing to them. You know, like, I put that GPS system in her car because she can't be trusted. If it wasn't that she was going out speaking to all these men, well, I wouldn't have to monitor her so closely. Whereas someone who maybe does that in every relationship, that's just what they do, you know, to gain dominance over the other person. Now, whether it's instrumental or instinctive doesn't really matter to the victim, does it? Because it causes the same harm. I mean, it might be different in terms of the response of the victim when they know that someone is like a psychopath versus paranoid and jealous, but they're both being tracked, right? And so this reasonable person test is a really like critical part of the Scottish legislation. Now, one of the things I've struggled with, especially since writing the book, I mean, when you first start working on this, it's all very black and white. It's like it either is domestic abuse or it's not, you know. Here are the signs. If you fit that, then you fit the profile. But since writing the book, but especially since talking to a lot of people at writers' events, and especially people who aren't necessarily victims per se, but who hear me talk about coercive control and they're like, you just described my partner. And then they'll talk to me about what's going on and I'm like, I just don't know exactly whether that fits that. It's like this grey area, right? It's like they're really worrying signs and that's abusive behaviour, but is it domestic abuse? Is it something that, are you in danger? You know, is this something that you need to deal with, or is it just a shitty relationship that you'd be better off out of? So one of the best distinctions I've read comes from the College of Policing in the UK, would you believe? And I think what's really important about this is because sometimes we really fixate on the fact that victims, we know that a victim is going through coercive control because they feel fear, but that may not be the case because some people may go out of their way to be compliant because they don't want to cause a fuss, right? They don't even know necessarily that they're afraid, but they've changed all of their behaviour to fit in with certain rules. And it may not be till much further down the line they actually feel a sense of fear that they'll admit to. Because remember, they're rationalising in all sorts of ways to try to pretend that they're not in an abusive relationship, you know. So this is their distinction. In many relationships, there are occasions when one person makes a decision on behalf of another, or when one person takes control of a situation and the other has to compromise. The difference in an abusive relationship is that decisions by a dominant partner can become rules that, when broken, can lead to consequences for the victim. And I just think that's a really useful distinction, that it's all about, if, say, there's a power imbalance in the relationship in certain areas, but you're able to negotiate it, right? You know, and if you do something different, there's not going to be consequences for you. The consequences, I think, are really important to consider. So, as was evident in Sarah's story, coercive control often doesn't end with the relationship. The choice to end the abuse cannot be made by the victim. That's in the hands of the perpetrator. And often enough, they'll continue to use whatever system is available to them for years to punish and exert control over their victims. And this is especially true if there are kids involved. And our family law system, which is bent very strongly, culturally, towards maintaining ongoing contact with both parents, is a perfect ecosystem now for abusers to control, terrify, humiliate, and even bankrupt their victims. It's also a perfect ecosystem for them to maintain a system of coercive control over their children. And what's freaky about this, I don't know about you guys, but what I've noticed, especially lately, I've been reading judgments from the 90s, early 90s, and what I've noticed is there was so much more care taken around attachment to primary caregivers, but also the effect of having one parent constantly denigrating the other, or where there was an abusive dynamic, that would be harmful to the child and would actually be enough to prevent access. I don't know if any of you can imagine that being adequate for a no contact order now. I mean, what you need now to get a no contact order, I mean, it changes from judge to judge. Some are happy to provide contact with convicted child sex offenders. So what's difficult, I guess, is that we've actually gone backwards in the family law system. As the rest of our sort of processes have evolved and become more aware, it's like the family law system has devolved, and actually this whole idea of pro-contact, that we must maintain relationship with both parents, means that when a protective parent wants to try to restrict custody, contact with the other parent, time and again you see them getting punished by the family law system for even sort of suggesting that, for getting in the way of what the court needs to have happen. And I've seen some just horrifying cases, and I'm sure all of you have as well. So what's even more difficult, especially when considering intervention orders, is that coercive controllers may make no assaults or threats against their victims for months or years, but the threat may remain just as great and the victim still needs protection. But how do you persuade a judge of that? So what does coercive control look and feel like? So to illustrate this, in the book I ran through the chart of coercion that was developed by US Air Force sociologist Albert Biederman in the 50s, and it was done based on interviews with returned American prisoners of war from Korea, and he interviewed them because they were colluding with the enemy in unprecedented ways, making false confessions to atrocities that hadn't happened, decrying Western capitalism, informing on fellow prisoners, even defecting to communist China. And everyone, up to the head of the CIA back in America, thought that they had been brainwashed, that there was some sort of magic tool that the Soviets had to erase a man's brain and reinstall new memories. And they busily got into their labs trying to recreate this brainwashing tool. And meanwhile, Albert Biederman's like, yeah, nah. And he went and interviewed all these returned servicemen. And what they told him was that they had been subjected, even in isolation, they didn't know each had been subjected to the same thing, but to the same basic techniques. And he developed this chart of coercion. And it wasn't until about the 1980s, after shelters had been around for 5 or 6 years, that researchers began to see, and that basically Albert Biederman's chart of coercion fit exactly the experiences of domestic violence victims. So it's his work that has really formed the foundation of what we understand about coercive control. So the first is isolation, and obviously there are obvious elements to this: cutting victim off from supportive family and friends, setting a worldview that pits him and her against the world and denigrates her family and friends as outsiders who will never understand what they have. But he may also have been drawn to her because she was already isolated. As one survivor pointed out to me last week, after growing up with childhood domestic violence, she already didn't trust other people and didn't have any close friends. So she fell for that narrative that it was him and her against the world. Alternatively, he may collude with her family, or even worse, with a former partner who was a perpetrator, especially if there's a fractured family relationship to exploit. They may even testify on his behalf, which isolates the victim entirely, because who's going to believe her when her own family says she's crazy? And that brings up, how do we believe her if all these people are maybe contacting us and saying, no, she's crazy, she makes up lies. When there's no proof either way, what do you do? So it's very trapping. Then he monopolises her perception. He redirects her attention away from his abuse to her faults. If she wasn't so this, he wouldn't be so that. This can make a lot of sense to her because, especially if, like many perpetrators, he seems to love and care for friends and family, it seems like she's the only one he's attacking, so it must be she who's provoking him. And she's so busy trying to figure out what she's doing wrong or how she can help him that she doesn't notice what he's doing to her. So her perception has been monopolised both inwards and, as we'll see, starts to be monopolised by him, in which it's actually safer to start to see the world through his eyes rather than through hers. So coercive controllers also induce debility and exhaustion. Now, obviously, gaslighting has become like a term that is widely known now. It was Macquarie Dictionary's almost word of the year a few years ago. I think for the uninitiated in the room, gaslighting is basically a term for when an abuser denies, fabricates and manipulates situations to make his partner doubt her own memory and perception. And as she becomes more confused and anxious, she starts to believe that his interpretations of events are more reliable than her own. It's remarkably common. I'm sure you guys hear about it a lot. One woman I spoke to who was with an extremely dangerous and charming coercive controller for just 2 months, who gaslit her relentlessly, told me that, my keys were there 1 second and then they weren't. There was $50 in my wallet and then it wasn't. And then he would say, are you losing your mind? Like, what's wrong with you? In the end, she thought she was going mad. And once he'd made her doubt her sanity, he told her that she should go to his doctor to get something prescribed. And when she tried to leave him, he said he'd kept the prescription for antidepressants and would use it to undermine her credibility if she took him to court. Now, this guy was one of those guys who goes into every relationship with the same modus operandi. Another common way of inducing debility is by coercing or even forcing the victim to take pain medication or illegal drugs. I mean, what better way to reduce a person's to compliance and render her testimony utterly unbelievable than to get her to use heroin? So in order to train the partner to be compliant, the abuser starts to enforce trivial demands. He might forbid her from wearing skirts or speaking to other men, or he may just set rules that are arbitrary and spontaneous and that are enforced without warning. The rules are ever-changing and often contradictory, but to avoid punishment, she must know them by heart. Now, children too must know these rules, and I must say it's very important to understand that in coercive control, children are existing in a symmetrical system. They're not just witnesses to violence, they're not just witnesses to trauma or harm, they are intricately involved in the emotional and psychological processes of both parents. So for 9-year-old Finley, who was a keen gamer, he told me that he'd learned to read his father's face like an algorithm. He had to, because he had to be able to predict when his father was in a dangerous mood. It was really random, he said. If the sky wasn't blue enough, he'd get angry. The rules would be valid for 10 seconds and you'd be abiding by them, but then the new rule would state that you're doing something wrong just so he could get mad at you. In this unpredictable environment, victims must see the world through the perpetrator's eyes so they can predict their next demand before they are punished for breaking it. And to make resistance seem futile, the coercive controller must prove that no matter what the victim does, escape is impossible. And to do this, he must demonstrate his omnipotence. He might subject her to relentless monitoring, install cameras around the house, or even install surveillance software on her phone and literally spy on her conversations and track her movements. As one survivor told the BBC this week, he would drop snippets into conversations, such as knowing about a friend's baby, really private things that he shouldn't have known about. And if I asked him how he knew these things, he'd say I told him, and accuse me of losing it. Another said her husband would play mind games with her by repeating specific phrases that she and her friends had used in private conversations. He was spying on her through her phone's microphone. All of this is done to make her feel like no matter what she does, he will always be right behind her and she will never be safe. She will never have any privacy. Evan Stark says, coercive control basically looks like a victim trying to find safe spaces where they have breathing space, and a perpetrator coming and searching and destroying those spaces. Now, I had one older woman come up to me at a writers' festival who really illustrated how extreme this can get. She was asking me where she could go for help. I was in Brisbane. I had a few ideas, but I didn't really know the scene. But she said she couldn't make a phone call because her phone was tapped. She couldn't tell anyone because he would know. He knew everything. And there was another author sitting next to me who obviously thought this woman was mentally unhinged. But to me, she just sounded like someone who'd been conditioned to believe her partner was omnipresent. And she'd obviously been in the marriage for a really long time. And he probably was. Surveillance is incredibly common. I don't know how many times you guys come across it, but one private security group that works with refuges to sweep women's cars and check their phones for spyware said that at one refuge in Victoria, around 85% of the women were being tracked in some way. And for many years, those women were disbelieved, even by the sector. So as coercive control escalates, each abusive strand is woven so tightly and imperceptibly that it's almost impossible to actually describe what's happening to outsiders. Without proof, it's her word against his, and her story is starting to sound so crazy, it sounds implausible. One of the most dangerous and important elements of coercive control is not abusive at all. It's what Biderman called alternating punishments with rewards. So aside from extreme situations in which the abuse is unrelenting, and there are some, the perpetrator will at times profess their love, offer gifts, show kindness and express remorse. They don't always do that just to trick their partner. Sometimes they really feel like they mean that. Other times it's manipulation. I mean, both times it often ends up being manipulation, but sometimes it comes from different places depending on who it is. So those periods of kindness, no matter how short they are, bond the victim to her abuser. And even if she's reminded only momentarily of the man she fell in love with, she may be duped into letting her guard down and sharing things, perhaps even erotic photographs, that the abuser may later use against her, perhaps by threatening to publish them online or threatening to present them in court. And that did happen to one woman I spoke to. It was used to threaten her in family court. And even after her partner was convicted for threatening to kill their 18-month-old and holding a samurai sword to her throat, they spent 8 years in family court fighting that case. So there are two more techniques, threats and degradation. Threats are the binding element of coercive control. They are what render a woman captive and tell her that if she leaves, she'll be putting not only herself, but possibly her friends, family, and children in danger. They may be indirect, as we were saying before, like Carl ranting about the women killed that year. It's an atmosphere of threat they create. They may never make those threats directly. Threats are also made to children to control them and to cause distress to their mother. When he was bored, Finley's father would devise new ways to terrorise his children, and one particular favourite was a threat to take Finley to the doctors, where he said Finley would have hot pipes stuck up his nose. In other cases, I've seen children talk about the fact that their father would put the cat in the dryer and turn the dryer on. It's like creating this feeling of threat, like nothing is safe or sacred in the house, and that there's no point in loving anything. Because if you love that, then it may be destroyed, and that's perhaps one of the most debilitating and harmful effects of coercive control, especially for the children, but especially for the mother. If she gives too much attention to the children, that may end up with them being punished, that they are coerced to neglect their children so as those children don't get further harmed. So lastly, the victim is degraded. Sometimes degradation goes so far it reaches a level of dehumanisation. Evan Stark explains that women in his practice have been forced to eat off the floor, wear a leash, bark when they wanted supper, or beg for favours on their knees. In many of these sickening scenarios, both the perpetrator and their victim were known to friends and family as friendly, regular people. Mothers who are being abused will frequently risk their lives to defend their children, but others may be so thoroughly dominated that they allow or even enable or cover up the abuse of their children, or even punish them for trying to defend themselves. This is why it's especially important in situations where a victim of abuse has also victimised their child to identify whether they were doing so in the context of coercive control. How much agency did they have? Why did they do it? Again, Stark talks about sitting down with a mother and son who told him about the time that she held the son's hand on the stove. The father had threatened her that if she didn't do it, he would do worse, and both mother and son knew that what she had done was the best action possible. But what might a court think about that? What might child protection think? What would you think? What if the perpetrator had a video of that happening, of the child screaming and of the mother doing that? And then, do you believe their claims that they were coerced? So many women will spend months or years trying to rationalise the insane abuse being perpetrated against them. Even after the abuse becomes extreme, even when it becomes physical, they may not actually see that they're a victim of domestic abuse. They may in fact regard themselves as the strong one, the only one who can help their troubled partner face their demons. But as we know, women stay in coercive control relationships for a multitude of reasons, because they want to fix their partner, because they can't afford to leave, because they're afraid of what he'll do once he's out of her line of sight, once she loses that almost psychic connection to him, because they're afraid that they and their children will be impoverished as a result, because they cannot bring themselves to wait in a boarding house or motel for the several days it takes to get in a refuge, because they love him and believe he will change. Before I finish today, I want to highlight how coercive control entraps children. This is something that we've only really just become aware of, even though probably a lot of you have had instinctive awareness of for a long time. I think a lot of us just, if we deal with children a lot, we hear these stories, but researchers have not made it a point to study it. So for decades, researchers have treated children as though they were like housemates with their parents, not intricately involved and affected by their parents' emotional and psychological lives, but just harmed by witnessing violence like we might be harmed by watching a gory movie. But as we now understand, the experience of children within the system of coercive control is symmetrical to the experience of the victim. A recent study by UK researcher Emma Katz found that children who had lived through coercive control, when no physical violence was present, had all the same resultant harms as children who had witnessed or experienced direct physical or sexual abuse. Children who grew up with coercive control were to return home each day to houses where they can feel defenceless and afraid, or where it's their job to protect their mother and siblings. They know all the best places to hide, how to make themselves disappear or dissociate, and train themselves into the habit of dissociation when the yelling starts. They are punished for trying to protect their mother. They hold her while she cries and they help her wash off the blood. They comfort and hush their siblings. They call police to beg for help. They try to make their father get angry with them instead of their mother. They are recruited as spies. They blame themselves and get blamed for the violence, and they fantasize about hurting or killing their abusive parent. Sometimes they do kill them, or try to. They beg their mother to leave because one day he's going to kill her. They see their parents come home from hospital and carry on like everything is normal. They watch their father get arrested. They know the violence is their own fault, and that if they can just find a way to be good enough to do or say the right thing, it will stop. And deep down, many are terrified that when they grow up, they too will turn into an abuser or end up marrying one. These children have to develop their own strategies to survive, not just physically, but psychologically. As Judith Herman writes, these children must find a way to preserve a sense of trust in people who are untrustworthy. And when I say untrustworthy, sometimes, unfortunately, the victim is also that for the child, because the victim may have a coerced loyalty to the parent who is being abusive to the children. The victim may also blame the child for the abuse that they're receiving. There are so many there's multitudes that go on in these relationships and these families. So they must seek control in a situation that is terrifyingly unpredictable, power in a situation of helplessness. In too many cases, this develops into complex trauma, a developmental disorder that is fundamentally caused by chronic betrayal. This is why any interventions directed at the adult victims must always consider and include their children. And sometimes, as one child survivor said the other day, include children as individuals in their own rights, as primary victims in their own rights. And sometimes that might mean, and I'm not sure what the limitations are on this, but what this woman Annika was saying is that she wanted to be consulted privately. She didn't want to talk about it in front of her mother because of lots of reasons. Could be that a mother might end up going back to the perpetrator, and when everything's nice, she tells him what the children said. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why children should be considered as independent of their parents. So how do you identify coercive control? In the Safe Lives training on coercive control in Scotland, they highlight how best to discover it. So basically, it's about interrogating feelings instead of just facts. So it's important to ask lifestyle questions such as, what is life like for you? Tell me what's the first thing you think about when you wake up in the morning? And especially, tell me about what you do in this relationship that you would not normally choose to do, but are too scared not to. Because as we know, it can be very difficult for victims to even to see themselves what's gone on in their relationship so that they can recount it to you. So sometimes it's about asking those questions that open up their way of thinking, make them log into that part of their brain and try to remind them of who they were before this all started happening. And lastly, I just want to leave you with the idea that essentially coercive control is a crime against the victim's dignity. And Alan Wade and Linda Coates from the Centre for Response-Based Practice in Canada teach this around the world, that humiliation is at the core of coercive control. And as they say, for many people, it is the humiliation that is the primary and deepest affront. The scars of humiliation and shame stay with victims long after the bruises have faded. And that's why Wade and Coates emphasise that whenever we are intervening in cases of domestic abuse, our first principle should be, how do we uphold the dignity of that person? Thanks very much.